Hey, Renegades. Welcome to this week's episode of House of Other. I am super thrilled to tell you that we are speaking with Alicia Roth Weigel. Now, listen, Lauren and I, when we first started, putting together this podcast, had put Alicia's name down on a must-have guest on our podcast. But we were also like, we need to get a little traction here before we reach out to her, show her that we have, something solid. And anyway, during South by, I went with my child to see some bands play at San Jose. And we're in the parking lot and we're dancing. And there's probably a couple hundred people there. And I look over and it was Alicia. And I started shaking. I was like, oh my God, I have to go talk to her. And I felt really awkward about that because I think, approaching people in public, like sometimes that can be a little off-putting and rude. But for the cause of House of Other and for all of you listening, I was like, I will do it for us. And I approached her and I said, I just want to introduce myself and thank you for all the work you're doing. And she gave me the biggest hug. And I was like, we are recording a podcast that we're speaking to parents and caregivers about sex positive. And she cut me off and said, yes, when would you like to record? And it gives me the chills even talking about it because her activism and her voice, it is so real and she is so involved and she is so inspiring to listen to and to see all the work she does. So you're going to hear today, like, for example, while she was working with Wendy Davis, she came out publicly to the Sexist Senate during the bathroom bill discussion in 2017 that she was intersex. While speaking with Alicia, we not only learned about the policies and practices that shape the intersex experiences, but we hear firsthand from her what it's been like for her personally. You're going to hear resources and statistics like, for example, intersex is more common than identical twins. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. I've had more people reach out and ask me, what is intersex, after they saw us post that we interviewed her, and it is explained to detail what it is and what it's not. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome to House of Other, a podcast for parents who just don't understand. If you don't know what the younger generation is talking about when it comes to sex, gender, and everything in between, it's okay. You're not alone. Join me, Ashley Kelsch, and my co-host, Lauren Camp, each week as we give you and your sex education a modern update and teach you how to have those conversations with your kids. All right, today we are joined with an intersexy guest, Alicia Roth Weigel. Did I say that right?
You did.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Intersex activist and intersectionality advocate, as well as Austin's reappointed Human Rights Commissioner. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're so glad you're here, especially considering our serendipitous meeting that brought us to this table.
Yes.
South by, which was so not random, but random.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I was really excited. I was kind of like fanning out, which was weird.
Yeah.
I was like literally like seeing us, because you're like a celebrity in my mind, because I follow you and your work and everything you're doing. And I was like, this is huge, like to see you here in a parking lot. And I was like, how do I talk to this person without being weird?
Yeah. Well, it was good to meet a lot of different people at South by. It's always really exciting.
Yeah.
Also really exciting to have it die down and end and get to sleep again.
Yeah, but I imagine you have a lot of people that approach you.
It started happening more for sure. Someone hugged me at a South by event this year and they just walked up and just started sobbing.
Oh,
that's the first time that's happened before.
I just got the chills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's starting to happen more for sure, which is good. I mean, we're trying to get more visibility. So that means that something's working.
No, definitely it's working. So with that, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and who you are?
Yeah. So as you said, my name's Alicia. I'm originally from Philadelphia. I ended up here in Texas in 2016, about 2 weeks before the presidential election that year. So interesting timing to move to Texas. And Texas has become my home. And a lot of that is because back in 2017, I ended up coming out as intersex, which I know we'll get into in a minute because I'm sure a lot of listeners are not familiar with that word, but ended up coming out for the first time in front of the Texas Senate during some of the bathroom bill hearings. Mm-hmm. So if folks remember that, these were legislation that was trying to target the ability of trans folks to use a restroom that aligns with their gender, trying to force them to use restrooms that align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Mm-hmm. And I was just kind of pointing out the hypocrisy of it all, because there are a lot of people like me who are born with bodies that don't fit into either of those categories that were forced into on birth certificates. And so I was asking the senators like where I was supposed to pee, because I knew if I started peeing outside, then I might get arrested for public urination, or it just seems pretty unsanitary. So
yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. So yeah, that's when I first came out as being intersex, which for those who don't know, intersex is an umbrella term for a broad variety of variations or ways to be a human in ways that where your sexual and reproductive anatomy does not fit neatly into that male or female category. So for me, I was born with XY chromosomes, which I don't think you would ever know looking at me. I present very femme. I look very cis-passing female, but instead of being born with a uterus and ovaries, I was born with internal testes, which were then subsequently removed, and we'll get into all of that later as well. But so for me, my intersex variation is called complete androgen insensitivity, which basically means that my body does not respond to androgen hormones, or what most people would call quote unquote male hormones. So even though I have XY chromosomes, my body did not respond to the quote unquote masculinizing hormones in the womb. And so I never developed like a penis or external testicles. Like I look very femme on the outside. And so it's interesting because when my mom was pregnant with me, she had gotten in a car crash with her and my father, and they rushed to the hospital and they did all these tests on my parents, including an amniocentesis test, which uses a needle to check on a bunch of information. And that test had told my parents that I had XY chromosomes. And so they thought they were going to have quote unquote a baby boy. So they had painted everything blue, and they were going to name me Charles after my father and both my grandfathers. And then lo and behold, when I'm born, I have a vagina. And so everyone was really confused. So it's interesting that if they had not gotten in that car crash, they never would have known what my chromosomes were. And they would have just assumed that I was just like any other XX female that was born. So it's pretty serendipitous. And they never would have even found out that I'm intersex until I never got a period when I was a teenager, because, you know, I don't have a uterus and ovaries. But because of that car crash, because they knew about my chromosomes, and that it didn't match what you would expect in terms of my genitalia, they knew from day one that I was intersex, that I was born on the spectrum between male and female. And so they started all of these interventions on my body very early. That's not always the case for intersex people, because there are so many different ways to be intersex. So some people have external genitalia that doesn't fit neatly into a penis or vagina category. Some people have internal differences like me. There are all different chromosomal structures that exist. There is something called mosaicism, where certain intersex people have different chromosomes in all different cells. So like some of their cells are XX and some are XY and some are XXXY and some are XO. And there's also a chimera, which is a variation of being intersex, where you're essentially two, I guess it would be zygote. I'm not sure what stage in the womb, but two basically like fertilized eggs that fuse in utero. And so it's basically like two humans in one that become one human. And so they can have all different sorts of chromosome patterns. So it's really cool. There's a really broad natural variation in ways to be a human. Unfortunately, people and society like neat little boxes and categories to put people into, which we hear all the time for people who might be multiracial or people who, you know, don't fit into those categories. You tend to face a lot of problems because the human brain likes to categorize and compartmentalize folks. And so when you're born intersex, you know, there are a lot of parents that are are freaked out that their kid is not normal. And so they might ask doctors to intervene, or sometimes there are doctors that carry a lot of bias and they urge parents to intervene. And they basically start enacting all of these procedures on our body to quote unquote normalize us, meaning push us into that male or female category. There are a lot of negative repercussions to a lot of those that we could get into.
Can you share, given that your parents knew sort of from birth or day one for you, right? Like, what was that information like for them to receive in terms of they realized this isn't what we were expecting to come out? How did the doctors start to relay that information and then to start to try to, quote, put you in a box? And then from there, as you were sort of aging and gaining awareness, what was the information that was like shared to you? How did they kind of tell you, like, Alicia, this is what's going on?
Yeah. So when the doctors told my parents, they told my parents that I had like a disorder called complete androgen insensitivity, which is, again, how folks refer to my variation of being intersex. And they told my parents that I had internal testes that could become cancerous one day. Mm-hmm. And when you're a parent and you have a newborn and you're hearing that your child might get cancer.
Yeah, fear.
You have fear. Yeah. You're full of fear. And any good parent is going to want to do whatever is in their power to avoid their child getting cancer. And so at the recommendation of the doctors that they had, they ended up doing what they call a gonadectomy, what I call a castration, because let's call a spade a spade. They removed my testes when I was an infant. And the actual like medical research and data that we have now shows that my risk as someone with complete androgen insensitivity of getting testicular cancer would have been less than 1%, which is way lower than the risk of any like traditional cis man getting testicular cancer. So you don't see them removing like little boys' balls without asking them. But for kids like me, we're not considered normal and our rights are not upheld. And so people make these life-altering decisions for us, which for me sterilized me. And not only did that, affect my ability of when and whether to have children, but the way that my body would have worked is my testes would have produced testosterone, but because my body does not absorb testosterone, as I mentioned, I'm insensitive to androgen hormones, my body would have peed a lot of it out, but then also converted some of it to estrogen. It's kind of like a superpower that I have. So I would have just developed naturally. And yes, there is a less than 1% risk that I could have had cancer one day, but that could have easily been monitored. But instead, by sterilizing me, they took my only hormone producing organs, which basically put me into menopause as a child because our bodies produce hormones for a lot more than just sexualizing purposes. Like our hormones control everything in our bodies, right? They regulate so many different processes. So for me, I had a lot of mental fog and hot flashes and issues with depression as a kid. And because I was growing up in hormone withdrawal and was not having those hormones replenished until I reached an age that they wanted to push my body to look a certain way, that ended up leaching a lot of calcium from my bones. And I now have osteoporosis at age 31, which is wild because you usually think of that in the elderly. But here I am. Y'all know I just ran here. I'm an avid runner and I do yoga and I'm like super fit and active. And yet my spine is disintegrating in my early 30s.
We're both over here like speechless. Yeah. Jaws dropped. So in hindsight, when you like having conversations with your parents, did they feel that they were being properly informed at the time? I mean, obviously like they were making the best decisions based on what they knew. Yeah. But looking back, they're like, we did not have enough information to.
It took a while to get there because my mom is like freak genius and has had a bunch of different careers. But one of those careers, she used to be a cardiac nurse practitioner. So she thinks of herself as rightfully so, like very able to navigate medical systems and to understand. she was in a much better position than a lot of other parents of intersex kids who don't have a medical background. So she really did believe she was doing what was best for me. So when I first came out and started advocating for myself, in the beginning, she took it as me advocating against her and against what she had done. And it frankly, my mom and I have a phenomenal relationship now. She's one of my biggest supporters. But there was a really rough period that I hear happens a lot with parents of intersex kids where she had to reckon with having been a part of those decisions.
Right.
And I think at first there's a phase of defensiveness or just the ongoing feeling of like, all I ever wanted to do was what was best for my child.
Yeah.
And I think it took a while for her to understand that it was a combination of being underfed sufficient information and also being part of a society that likes to try to force normalize people that don't fit a certain mold. And that what we often think of doctors as like gods, or we think of medicine as like this like golden word that we all trust like inherently and innately.
Right.
But we've seen so much bias in medical systems, right? I mean, we still have the highest maternal mortality rate for Black women in the world here in the state of Texas because Black women are not believed for their pain. Speaking of further medical abuse of Black communities, I mean, they used to test on slaves. Modern gynecology was developed using enslaved women's bodies without their consent.
Right.
So there's so much history of medical abuse. And just, I think it's important for us to understand that we need to question medicine just like we do any other system because doctors are human beings and they come with their own inherent biases.
Correct.
Yeah.
Do other intersex folks that have the androgen insensitivity like you, is this a very shared experience in terms of menopause? Is it similarities or like symptoms or
symptoms?
That was like,
yeah, menopause is just the easiest word to describe it because menopause is when your hormone production like rapidly decreases at a certain age.
Yeah.
Mine was not because of a certain age. Mine was because they took my testes from me.
Yeah.
So it's not perhaps the exact right word for it. The other thing I would want to point out is that, so I have complete androgen insensitivity, which is also different than partial androgen insensitivity. So I was completely unresponsive to androgen hormones, which is why my body didn't masculinize at all. So I also don't grow like underarm hair, for example, and a lot of other what you would consider like masculine sex traits. But there are certain people who have partial androgen insensitivity and their genitalia looks different than mine. Their bodies often look different than mine. So I just want to be super like clear in the terminology that we're using.
Yeah.
But in terms of people with complete androgen insensitivity like me, those who have been sterilized often end up with osteoporosis. That's very, very common. It's something that we look for now. And I had been avoiding getting my bone density scan for a few years because one, I was afraid what we would find. And two, when you've experienced a lot of medical abuse and doctors who have really messed things up for you in the past, you have like a real reluctance to like go to doctors and trust doctors. So going to the doctors can still be a very triggering experience for me, especially because so many doctors aren't even taught about intersex people in med school. And so really to see doctors that know how to treat intersex bodies, I would have to like fly across the country, which is a huge inequity. It's really expensive. What I've ended up doing here is basically training a bunch of doctors to become more competent, which is frustrating that I have to do that.
Right.
I didn't go to med school. I don't get paid to do this. But, you know, I just hope that other kids might grow up with more competent doctors than I've had, because I've experienced some like true horror stories. I've been in like stirrups at the gynecologist and have people be like, but you look so normal down there. And they're like, hey, come look at her. Like she's on, like she has XY chromosomes and she doesn't get a period, but like, look, and they treat you like a circus freak,
right,
or like an animal in the zoo. So I can't remember what the original question was.
Well, just to say that your experience with your hormones as a child and then now to have the later effects of osteoporosis at such an early age.
Yeah.
This isn't certainly unique to you. There are
not unique to me at all.
many other folks in the community that have to deal with that. And then it speaks to a very interesting trade-off that, as you said, the biases of the medical community are making that in this risk of potential testicular cancer, you're probably definitely going to have osteoporosis at an earlier age.
Yeah, so it's wild. I mean, one of our big messages is just, if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
There was nothing wrong with me, and in trying to fix me, they broke me.
Yeah.
You know, going back to the doctors and what's going on in there, which I consider to be really unethical, really, because not much has changed, right?
Yeah.
I was watching a series, I think it was called Masters of Sex, with Johnson and Masters, who did all the research about sex and orgasm, et cetera, in the 50s. And there were some episodes about babies being born intersex, and then doctors who had no, I don't even use the words credentials, experience or know how to mutilate these babies, cut.
Yeah.
And there was a specific where they said it's easier to dig a hole than
build a pole. And by that, they mean it's easier to create a vagina than to create a penis for a child.
It was so disturbing. And the family dynamic was upsetting, but then also knowing what's happening to these babies, and it's still happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a doctor named Dr. Dix Papas, which is kind of funny. He's at Weill Cornell Medical College, and I actually went to Cornell, so my tuition that I paid is funding his salary, ironically. But I hosted a big protest with some other intersex activists this past year in New York City at that hospital, because he recommends clitoral surgery on little intersex kids who he has what he calls a phallometer, which is what he measures to be what he considers quote unquote normal length of a clitoris to be. And if it's longer than that, then he recommends that parents cut it down.
Oh my God.
And then he tests on these little kids with vibrators to see if they still have sexual sensation. And this is done at like a major university hospital in New York City.
I mean, it seems wrong on so many levels that it's like I can't even fathom that that's happening.
Yeah.
How is he selling that to like parents or even for people to continue funding him? Like, what is the reasoning behind
Because there's still such a pervasive idea, which is, it's just like when a parent's kid comes out as gay, their first instinct is like, no, because you're going to have such a rough life.
Right.
And so parents are like, oh, my kid's genitals don't look quote unquote normal. They're going to have such a rough life. So it will be better to make them look normal to avoid that shame and that persecution or being made fun of. But what they don't realize is that these surgeries are traumas in and of themselves, that they often leave people with lack of sexual sensation, with scarring, with pain. Oftentimes these kids will have to get multiple surgeries, and it's just done in a way where these kids are told, like, you're not normal and we have to fix you, and don't tell anyone because you'll be made fun of. And when you hear that messaging as a kid over and over, all you internalize is like, I'm not lovable as who I am.
Right.
And so it's really like, change their hearts, not our parts. The solution to kids being gay is to make society more accepting of gay kids. It's not to try to electric shock the gay out of them.
Right.
And the solution with intersex kids is not to try to operate the intersex out of us. It's to make society more accepting and celebratory of diverse bodies. And there's so many areas where this happens, right? I mean, it's like when we look at fat phobia, for example, like there's just this generalized idea that when you see a fat person, like they must inherently be unhealthy and they must eat like shit and not take care of themselves and whatever. And that's just so not the case. It's just, there's such a wide variety of types of bodies. Like multiple of my friends would self-identify as fat, and they like work out and they go to the gym and they care about their health and they do stuff. And it's just like, bodies are born different, and we need to just normalize acceptance and celebration of that difference, not othering.
Can you tell us more about, we kind of touched on, coming out and the challenges, with your mom and then that being kind of later in life, but in terms of you growing up, your parents knew not the term that you were intersex, but having the androgen insensitivity.
Yeah.
What was it like to find this new term and
how did you find it? Like, what was that?
Yeah.
Probably a lot to that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, growing up, it was like this big secret, right? Like not even my brother knew. Like not my grandparents didn't know. Like no one beyond my parents knew, because that's how closeted intersex families are, because of the level of shame that still exists in society. And so I have a lot of traumatic memories as a kid of having to go to these doctors and lie to my friends about why. And, you know, when all my friends started getting their periods in middle school, I started carrying around tampons. Even though I don't have a uterus and ovaries, I would never have a period, but I had to keep up this like facade. And there was a sex ed class in middle school. And I remember they talked about intersex in a way. They didn't use that terminology. They probably called it like disorders of sex development, which is like a heavily stigmatized term that a lot of doctors still use. But I remember in this class when they were teaching about it, I was so terrified and afraid that I would be found out that I ended up having what I now in hindsight know to be a panic attack. And I passed out in the classroom, and like they took me to the nurse's office because I was just so scared that someone would discover who I really was. And so growing up, it was like really lonely, and I just felt completely alone all the time. And I couldn't fully connect with anyone in the way that I wanted to, because when you hold that much shame and secrecy, it's really hard to build like true, authentic connections with other humans. And so that loneliness was pervasive and, you know, led to a lot of like drinking and drug use and other stuff. We know that so much of addiction and abuse of substances stems from people lacking connection and lacking feeling like part of a community. So it wasn't until I was 27 and I was working for Wendy Davis at the time, who's a former state senator here in Texas. And she had a copy of Vogue magazine at the office. And I was like flipping through this magazine, and there was an intersex supermodel who had just come out as being intersex. And I was reading her story. Her name is Hannah Gabby O'Deal. She's now a friend of mine. And her story sounded so much like mine. And I had never heard the word intersex before. Because again, they tell you you have this disorder and that you're being fixed and never to talk about it. They never say, the doctors never say like, hey, you are intersex, you're part of this larger intersex community that's born in between, and there's tons of people around the world like you. So hearing that word for the first time in the context of this story, I was just kind of like shocked. And I like left the office early and I went home and I went on this Google rabbit hole for like hours and hours. And then that was, you know, over a quarter of a century of living was when I first finally even heard the term intersex or realized that I was part of this larger community and that there were other people out there like me. And it was just really, really eye-opening. That's why I try to share my story as much as I can, because whether it's parents of intersex kids listening or whether it's intersex people listening or friends or family members, like you're not alone. And there are so many of us. There are a lot of communities available for intersex kids, including here in Austin. Out Youth is this amazing organization that works with LGBTQIA plus youth, and they have great programming. There's online support groups specifically for intersex kids through an organization called Interconnect. There are so many resources and communities available so that people don't have to grow up feeling so alone.
Alone. And what I value about that is that people really underestimate the power of language.
Yes.
And connection in that regard. Like it's something a lot of parents ask is like, well, my kid went to a sleepover and they came back and now they're bi or they're this or they're that. And what is that? And this is why it's trending, et cetera. It's like, no, they have heard words and descriptions
that fit their experience
them and align with who they are and what they're experiencing. And that's how that happens.
Totally.
Yeah. So
it's not that these people didn't exist before. It's not that trans people didn't exist. It's that there wasn't a widespread terminology to where people could match what they were experiencing with language, like you said. And it's definitely the same with intersex people. I mean, it's that there's very heavily medicalized language being used. And we really are fighting against that, because when you call our experiences disorders, when truly there's nothing wrong with us, like we can lead healthy lives just as who we are, then calling us a disorder is stigmatizing our experience, and it's othering us, and it's making us into a problem when there is no problem. And so that's why we really, for example, the word hermaphrodite that's been used so much throughout time, there are actually some intersex people who have reclaimed that word, kind of like a lot of the Black community have like reclaimed the N-word, like in ways that feel comfortable to them. It's like a taking back their power. A lot of intersex people have as well, but a lot of us do not use that terminology because it's been used as the butt of jokes for generations.
It's rooted in negativity.
Right. And it also just paints a really false perception of, like, when people hear hermaphrodite, they think I'm walking around with like a fully fledged penis, set of balls, vagina, and ovaries, like all like hanging out in my pants, which is just like not reality.
I would call that like kind of like a superhero, but
yeah,
like, all the things,
right? Like all of the things, but that's not my reality either. And so I think like trying to use the intersex terminology is important because it depathologizes our experience. It helps us claim our identity and find one another, and it helps share more accurate information.
Right. 2% of the population that we know of is intersex, which is the same population as redheads and green eyes.
People with green eyes.
Yeah.
So people are like, oh, I've never met someone like that. It's like, you definitely have. You just didn't know it.
Right.
Yeah.
They might not have even
known it. Yeah. You hear there are intersex people that have different, variations than I do, who might have gone to the hospital. I know of one story where this woman went to the hospital much later in life for something totally unrelated. It was like, I don't know, she got injured, and then certain tests were ran and things were flagged, and then realized that she was intersex in her 40s. So there are a lot of people that might not even know that they are intersex.
Right. And so that's why it's important that the I is listed throughout, so that people can identify and know that this exists.
Totally. Yeah. And I think it's important, and people often are like, well, that's what the plus sign is for. And I'm like, okay, if the plus sign is to include other communities, then let's just remove the G. If the plus sign includes gay people, then let's just call it the LT plus community. And a lot of gay folks would be up in arms about that, right? So it's like when you're relegated to a plus sign, I know a lot of lesbians, gay folks, and trans folks that would not be okay with that. And for us too, the whole struggle is we're fighting for visibility. So having that I there, it means like someone might see LGBTQIA and be like, oh, what does that I stand for? And they might Google it, and they might find out more information.
Yeah. And especially right now, as we are discovering more about intersex and trans people, the policies that are being written against trans people and then forced upon intersex, I think we need to know that the I and the T are there so we can keep talking about all these things that are happening so that changes can be made.
Yeah, totally. A lot of people don't realize that these policies that are currently targeting trans kids in Texas and now other states across the country, they always include specific language about intersex people. It's just not picked up by the media because the media has so little understanding of our bodies and our community. In most of the bills in Texas, the word intersex is actually all throughout the bill language because certain political parties in Texas have done their research and found out a lot of information about our community, and they've used that to target us, which basically they're saying that we need to deny trans kids health care, meaning surgeries and hormones, where I want to make it clear, surgeries don't happen on trans kids anyway. That never happens. It only happens like as an adult. But they're saying deny this healthcare to trans kids, but then there's specific loopholes that say, but you can keep forcing those same procedures on intersex kids. And it's written into these bills. And in the recent opinion by Ken Paxton and Greg Abbott's recent release as well, we are referred to as disorders of sex development. So a lot of people don't correlate that with intersex, but we're written into those as well. We're always included in these attacks on the trans community, but it just shows the hypocrisy because they're saying deny this medical care from trans kids that you can force on intersex kids. So really, it's not abuse if they're okay with giving it to some kids. So you're okay with abusing some kids? Like, they know that it's not abuse. All they want to do is normalize children. And in their mind, being trans is not normal. So deny them the ability to realize themselves. And in their mind, being intersex is not normal. So they're saying operate it out of them.
Right.
Or force hormone feed it out of them.
Well, if we're speaking about the word denial, this kind of just sounds like it all is about denying that everything is a spectrum.
Totally.
Right? That gender is a spectrum and
sexuality is a spectrum.
Yeah, biological sex and sexuality is a spectrum. And that, I guess, even goes back further to the importance of having the I in LGBTQI+, is that intersex is part of this spectrum of folks that we're talking about.
Totally.
But for these bills denying, we want to force intersex kids to fit into either, the male or female box that we're checking on the birth certificate. And the same for trans kids. We want you to stick with the assigned gender at birth that we've given you. And we want to sort of, I don't know if it's further this heteronormative agenda. It might sound a little strong, but certainly this denial of the spectrum.
That's what it is. It's denial of science. It's denial of biology. It's denial of facts. And it's denial of the lived experience of a whole lot of people around the world.
What do you think about, and because this is a very hot topic right now and it's specific to trans women, it seems, in sports.
Yeah.
And I think you've talked about this before because they were saying that trans kids can't play sports.
Yeah.
And not knowing that perhaps there's intersex kids out there playing
Totally.
sports.
I played sports my whole life. I've always been very athletic. And it's like, so I was always on girls' sports teams with XY chromosomes and what would have been balls had they not taken my balls from me. And the irony is, like, just none of it is based in reality because, so again, my body doesn't respond to androgen hormones. So even if I had my balls and they were producing testosterone, my body wouldn't be able to absorb it. So it's just the parameters that they try to use to make these categories, like, leave out a lot of people like me, or they allow for a lot of imperfect and negative perceptions about a whole lot of people. And when you look at, like, the trans community in sports now and what's happening, I'm like, we're trying, just like with birth certificates, just like with anything, like, it's time to rethink these categories. Like, we should start, like, wrestling already has categories by weight class, or like there's so many different ways that we can enforce what people might think is a fair competition without denying and discriminating against people from participating. I'm an advocate for just abolishing these gendered sports categories in the first place because they've always left me out.
Right.
And now they're starting to leave out trans people.
I really like how you just said that about, like, weight classes and how it's happening there because, and to my mind, I have had that thought where I'm like, man, if this is like an MMA, is it MMA? I always ask, is it like those aggressive, like, fighting matches? I'm like, that doesn't seem like a fair fight.
Totally.
And so in my head, I'm like, well, maybe not there, but somewhere else. And so my brain has gone there, but it hasn't thought beyond that space of what you just mentioned, like weight class, or just not even having the gender.
Well, yeah. And I mean, you just look at who they're targeting. Michael Phelps has a genetic mutation that enabled him to exceed at sports. And yet they allow him, a cis white male, to compete, whereas they use a different, regulation or category of, like, oh, that was okay for him, but it's not okay for people to have had testosterone in their bodies at certain levels or whatever.
We declare this to be too much. And even though you are, a assigned woman at birth with all the, biological sex, we're still not going to let you go to the Olympics because your testosterone is more than
totally
allowed.
Or like that with Caster Semenya, for example.
Yeah.
My friend posted this to her story today. She said, when I hear stories about trans athletes and whether or not they should be allowed to compete, and let's be clear, we're always talking about trans women because no one is like, it's not fair for trans men to have to compete against cis men because biology. But anyway, she said, I think about my own body and how different it is from most cis women's bodies. I have been 6'2" since I was 15 and 200 plus pounds since I was 18. During that time, I played both high school and college water polo. Everyone looked at my difference as gifts. How lucky was I to have an atypical frame, to be taller and more muscular than other girls and women my age?
That is something we talked about because I was the same example of, like, I've had female friends that were built stronger, taller,
Totally.
much different than I'm built, or what you see like an average, maybe female body, and who excelled in sports for that reason. Is their testosterone at a different level? Like in my mind, I started asking questions. I'm like, how is it okay? And that their body structure is like that and it's acceptable.
And that it's
And no one's
acceptable.
testing or saying anything about it.
Totally.
Right. Whereas, and they're even saying what we're talking about with, is it Leah Thompson?
Yeah.
Testosterone levels are below.
Well, and when I saw this post online about how like they're not even knocking all these like records and stuff out of the water. Like their times have gone down since transitioning, and there are cis women
That's what
whose
Lauren
times
said.
are way
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
So it's
Katie
like,
Ledecky still holds her record, and she's a cisgender woman.
yeah, and she's a cisgender woman. So it's hypocrisy.
Mm-hmm.
The best one I saw was it was a photo of Katie Ledecky, and the person had been confused, thinking that it
Yes.
was Leah Thompson, and made some sort of transphobic comment, and people had to responding, that's actually Katie Ledecky, still holding world records, and a cisgender woman.
And a cisgender woman.
Right, but
Yeah.
speaking to, her frame of her shoulders and how, the argument I've heard from folks is if you had all of your quote-unquote male hormones allowing you to develop a frame to adulthood before you transition and then compete in women's sports, you have all these advantages.
Yeah.
And as we've just been talking about, right, like here's a cisgender woman with her own advantages. Like, she's fine.
Totally. And so it's like really they're not upholding the same standards for all different communities. They're only using it to attack Black women and trans women usually.
Yeah. And it makes me think like all the time and energy and effort they're spending on trying to keep everybody in a binary box and to keep things the way that just the society that they're trying to uphold. And time could be spent like rewriting these policies.
Totally. It
to
could
fit
be spent
everybody.
transforming
Yeah.
systems to be more inclusive.
Right. Like expanding beyond your fixed mindset and opening to what is here and what's in front of us.
And honestly, if we recategorize sports by weight classes or size of frames or whatever, like it would make for much more interesting competitions anyway. Think about it. You would have like people of similar sizes and abilities competing against each other. You wouldn't have like some 5'1" woman competing against one 6'3" woman, you know?
Mike Tyson.
Yeah, right. It's like I think it would make everything more competitive and like more exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what would you say to parents and children who are, their kids are intersex or they don't know how to have the conversations, or maybe they even have done what the doctor said and are thinking like, oh my God, did we do the right thing? And coming out, and what, like, do you have advice or?
Yeah, I would say first and foremost, like we all have to forgive ourselves and each other because we all do the best that we can with the information that we have. And unless someone is like a child abuser listening to this, if you're a parent, I can guarantee that you have done the best that you could for your kid with the information that you had. And I think there's also, though, the importance of learning better and doing better. Mm-hmm. I think it was Toni Morrison talked a lot about that. The more information we have and the more the world grows, like we can change and we can evolve and we can make things better. And a way to do that, there's an organization called Interact that does a lot of advocacy for the intersex community. They have a set of doctors on their medical advisory board that specialize in intersex issues in a variety of capacities. They have urologists, gynecologists, endocrinologists. There are definitely ways that you can get multiple opinions from doctors. I get outreach from a lot of parents who have recently had an intersex child or have recently found out their kid's intersex, and they just want to get the most accurate information out there. So Interact is a really good resource for people. Interconnect is a great org that connects intersex people as well as the families of intersex people. They have regular meetups. They have online and virtual programming. So that's a great option.
Yeah, I tried to go to the intersex meetup this week and
And then I got canceled.
sorry. Well, but you were so kind. You're like, this is for intersex people. And I was like, there I am. I'm like, I'm in.
Yeah, well, we love a good ally. We love a good ally. But yeah, we're trying to do more meetups for intersex people in Texas as well. We were going to have one this week and had to reschedule. But yeah, definitely if you want to follow me on social media, you'll see all the intersex things in Texas for sure.
You are carrying so much emotional labor on behalf of the community, and it's remarkable. So
Thanks.
My question is what can we do for you in the intersex community?
Yeah, I mean, really at the most baseline level, just like lifting our stories and sharing our work, I think being intersex is still so stigmatized, and we talk about these issues like genitalia and like sex and things that are like make people uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it is just like changing that narrative and like normalizing talking about these things. And there are a lot of people who I know would repost something about Black Lives Matter or about reproductive rights, but they wouldn't for intersex because they think that it's like inappropriate to talk about these things. But like, we all have bodies, we all have body parts. So really it's just like normalizing us in part of the conversation. Like, if you're advocating for all of these other issues, if you're trying to change the world, like, we need you behind us too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The obsession with people's genitals is kind of shocking to me. And then also like that they're not really body parts, they're sex organs, and that's it. And they're sexualized and therefore sex, and people can't see beyond that. And I'm like,
they do a lot of other stuff.
They do all kind. Yeah, the penis is a multi-use tool.
Yes, it is. It is a multi-use tool for sure.
Like, you really think about what's going on there. There's a lot, right?
Yes.
Versus like.
Same with the vagina,
yeah,
right?
Right. But the clit's the only organ that has one purpose.
And thank God for that.
Yeah. So grateful. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much. Did you have any more questions, Lauren?
Well, I want to jump back to something we talked about way earlier. Conversations with your family. I heard on another podcast you mentioned that your aunt is intersex. Is that
Yes,
correct?
she is.
I was really curious what those conversations were like.
She and I have only spoken once about the fact that she's intersex. So the closet is that much deeper for generations back.
Yeah.
Yep. She's a lot older even than my mom. She's almost like between my mom's generation and my grandparents' generation. So I can only imagine what she has had to go through.
Mm-hmm.
So, I told her that I was out so that she wouldn't find out on the news or something like that. But she and I have never really spoken about it again. I will, like, in a more hopeful note, though, say that this is part of my parents' learning process. But at first they were like, you can't tell your grandmas because it's too much for them to understand and it'll just confuse them and whatever. I came out to one of my grandmothers when she was 99, and she didn't like fully maybe understand all the nuances, but in her mind, she was like, why would people hate you? Jesus loves everybody. He would love you. And I was like, yeah, Jesus would love me. Like, he was a really cool dude. So
that's literally that same statement was made on the episode that came out today by my son.
Yeah.
Yeah. He's like, I just think if we're going to follow Jesus' example, it's like, we love everybody.
We love everybody. Yeah. So for her, she was just so confused why people would hate me, and she thought Jesus would love me. And, so that was pretty heartening for sure.
That is very heartening.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
The best. Oh, where can people find you? What's your Instagram?
My Instagram handle is XOXY_Alicia. Get it? Like, instead of XOXO. So XOXY_Alicia.
Yeah. And so we'll have all of that in the show notes, as well as the resources that were mentioned today, so that parents and caregivers, you can go online and find those to help inform and educate yourselves. Okay. Until next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to worry about missing another episode of House of Other, you can subscribe and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you haven't already, we would really appreciate if you could leave a review and a rating to let us know what you think and to help others find this House of Other podcast. It doesn't have to be a 5-star rating, although we sure hope you love the show. We want your honest feedback so we can create an awesome podcast that provides tons of value. Thanks for listening to House of Other. If you want more information or resources from today's podcast, visit modernrenegades.com. See you next week on House of Other.